even though it was unfortunately a little later than we had all hoped, that Ali Moussa has been here, of course, been here all day, but is here to moderate our last session as we hear from the different breakout sessions and then hear from you commenting upon those.
Thank you very much, Gary. So I apologize for coming late for a meeting on which we have been working for, I think, 1 year. But that is a decision beyond our control. So I would like, first of all, really to thank again all our partners with whom we really elaborate the program of this meeting. And I just want really to name the foundation, Thomas Jefferson Foundation, US, ICOMOS, the African American, the Museum, National Museum for African American History and Culture, and of course, University of Virginia and Montpellier Foundation. So really there, we work very hard. And I would like to thank also the organizing committee, which really worked on this, and also, I think, for the extraordinary organization of the logistic, the host committee that really make us everything easy to work. So thank you very much. That's really very, very, very helpful. So we designed this exchange and this meeting to be really a result-oriented. We want to have a concrete recommendation, of course, very lively discussion, and I think we had that, and also concrete recommendation to continue to work on this issue, and perhaps at the end to draft, to prepare, to elaborate together with you, but also with other experts, a kind of resource book or a handbook on how to help in the different countries in Africa, in Latin America, which are now get engaged in creating a slavery museum to help them not to reinvent the wheel, to learn from the mistakes that has been done over the last decade, and to benefit from your exchange and discussion, the benefit from the best practices so they can really begin from that way. So we want to have that kind of material, a handbook, a resource book that we will put online, free access to everybody, but we can also print some of them to distribute to our partners. So that's why we divide ourselves into 4 groups to discuss, to deepen the reflection on, and to come out with some concrete recommendation. So I would like now to ask the different group to present their conclusion, their recommendation. So I will begin. I don't know what is the name of the meeting room, but the group 1. The group 1 is the group meeting just downstairs.
So the group in the north, the group in the North Oval Room.
So Bill. Yes, please.
To the podium.
Thank you. And I know the members of our group, a very distinguished group, really will correct me and will add if I've omitted anything, please. It didn't come until midway through our conversation, but we were reminded that in developing our responses to the questions that we really should think very hard about what is the problem that we're here gathered to discuss, what are the desired outcomes that we wanted to see. And it was very simple. We decided we wanted more museums and sites talking about slavery, interpreting slavery, and we wanted them all to be doing it better. It really was quite that simple. And so with regard to principles, I really am going to synthesize down to the sort of a few words or sound bites. There are maybe 7 or 8 of them in terms of principles. These are glomming together long conversations. But the principles, I think, were historical accuracy and truth. We heard that repeatedly through our our presentations during the day, the truth, nothing but the truth. Community participation, care with language and naming, the use of terms which decolonialized the conversations, the storytelling, the interpretation. Interdisciplinary, that really a big enough house that everybody from the archaeologists to the living history and oral traditions and all of it could fit into the tent, into principles. Respect for human dignity, absolutely, goes without saying. Relevance and a high degree of engagement, really connecting with people, a principle that was important. Courageous, having courage in mission. Aspirational, at the same time as stating intention. You know, what is it that we as a site, a place, a museum, a storyteller are about, and to what do we aspire? And then related to that, of course, educational. So that, I lost the count there, but that is perhaps 8 or 9 principles. Next, moving on to the best practices. The best practices flow in part from these principles. Exchange, how do you identify best practices? It's really all about exchange of information between sites and museums and the places doing the storytelling or aspiring to doing the storytelling and interpretation. So that could be exchange through conferences and convenings, virtually through Facebook, a Facebook community. We learned about the sort of some of the history with regard to the formulation of website in the past, which has sort of aspired to sort of facilitate those best practice exchanges, and for a variety of reasons never quite hit the mark. But in any event, exchange, however it's done. Accreditation, if there could be some type of accreditation, a good housekeeping seal of approval, not dissimilar to the National Underground Network to Freedom that operates here in the States, that accreditation of some kind that relates back, or that the AMA, is AAM, AMA, does, a set of questions that a survey that the place, the institution, the individual fills out, a set of questions that relate back to the principles. Okay, so what are your plans for engagement, and how well do you do it, and et cetera. I gotta put my glasses on, I'm sorry. Impact, really, how do you discover best practices? What impact are you actually having on doing a better job at reaching more people and touching people, how again, relating back to relevance and engagement. Creating a source of advice, an oracle, a one-stop shop, and whether or not that could be the ISC, whether that has a place in UNESCO, whether or not the slave route ISC somehow could build on other similar efforts or activities. For example, the ICOMOS, International Scientific Committees, some of which have activities and programs and thematic foci that intersect quite squarely with some of this. We said working with existing organizations as relevant, for example, ICOM, the International Council of Museums, looking at the other existing sets of standards like the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. Another great source of best practices is simply distillation of the presentations that we've seen over the last few days. Lastly, the question about how do we create an ongoing and meaningful network between historic sites and other stakeholders, and a commitment some level to training the trainers so that we all can become better at encouraging each other and to raise the bar. A bridging organization, again, this relates to sharing of events and scheduled exchanges, focusing on cross-cultural similarities and differences. Perhaps, to the extent that there are annual Slave Root ISC meetings, a convening like this that could take place once a year, every year, or every other year, or with some frequency. It was observed that often a great way to create a network is to have a problem to solve, a specific problem to solve. So I'm sure we can come up with a problem. Something that could be very simple to help build the network would be simply some kind of awards or recognition program, which also is a way to sort of inventory sort of the state of the art, some of the cool stuff that's happening out there in the field that hasn't even registered with us yet, and then in honoring them, that becomes more widely known. And then last but not least, just regular meetings. There's nothing like the face-to-face. You can do it virtually. You can have a Facebook community or a website or a listserv, but there's nothing like the face-to-face. Group, did I miss anything important? Yes. Thank you.
I'll just add the issue of scale. So some institutions are an institution of 3 people or 2 people, and in other cases, we belong to institutions of 500 people or 1,000 people. So as we move to create standards and a way of communicating and working together, how are we inclusive and keeping scale in mind?
Anything else? Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. Please, could you send us later on the elaborated version of your report for our record? Yeah. Thank you very much. And now I would like to call the rapporteur of the Group 2, which meet here just downstairs in the Board of Visitors room.
So the other room that was in the rotunda.
I think is Sonia.
Yeah, Sonia.
The moderator for our group was Peter Haynes, and the group had very spirited discussion after introduction of participants, and we tried to give equal attention to each of our questions, but alas, as you would have heard in the previous presentation, there are some areas of overlap. So in response to question A, what principles should be followed? We elaborated on the question of language that needs to be addressed, examples to be culturally and historically sensitive in terms of language usage, eliminating words like runaway, slaves, and so on. The handbook should cater to the camera shy, the novices, the persons who have no knowledge of this history of slavery, or histories of slavery, and that it is not to be just pitched at the level of the scholar. A multicultural interpretation, and I will add to the interdisciplinarity that was identified earlier, a multicultural interpretation as well as a multi-generational interpretation of the legacies and representation of slavery. We found that this was necessary as a principle. Acknowledge indigenous populations where slavery took hold. Another important principle, that slavery needed to be understood in its longer historical and in terms of the representation of impact. How do we deal with private museums? This question came up, that there are public institutions and there are private ones, and that there was need for outreach to private institutions, that private and public museums exist but should not exist with different standards. The handbook has to link with contemporary issues today, so contemporary issues of slavery, such as the economic refugees we see today, moving into not just within the continent, such as areas in South Africa, Southern Europe, and so on, but we ought to have both on the continent and elsewhere. Second question, how do we identify best practices? Some of the best practices we thought of: combine efforts across institutions engaged with curriculum development and reform. This business of curriculum development and reform under the broader heading of education came up, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about education in a few minutes. Well, a few seconds, let's say. But that there are trouble areas, 7 trouble areas, for example, identified through the new curriculum being charted by the Southern Poverty Law Center. This was one of the areas we thought take on the work that's been done by other institutions. This ought to inform the principles inside of the handbook. A second example, which was brought up, the Woodson Institute. They sponsored recently a workshop for educators, and therefore this was seen to be important. A big thing that came up almost in all of the deliberations, the involvement of youth, important for these initiatives, not just the involvement of youth, but that the medium matters. We need to be engaging with popular media, film in particular, that the popularity of films such as Black Panther gave us the kind of examples we needed to be engaging in these popular media for multiple engagement levels. Creating a safe space. This links to one of the points I made earlier, but the creation of the safe space to be able to tell versions of the truth, to remember. Space in the handbook for people who are afraid to speak, silent or unconnected to the ongoing efforts to tell the story of slave histories. Another point, the process can begin with the kindergarten, as low as possible. So this is really the bottom-up approach. Eliminate the kind of education that promotes a trauma-informed instruction. Another point which was made, acknowledge humanity and skills brought by enslaved peoples, that we often hear of the people who came, the people who were enslaved as, the savages or those who were uncivilized. No, this is important in dispelling the myths that the people who came were in fact the architects, the people who with shipping technology inside the colonial project that was supported by knowledges which came from the continent. There is linked to that a psychological dimension that was identified here. This is the mechanism of challenging the identities that have seen themselves as superior versus inferior. This requires tools to engage all of the parties to rework and build new identities. We wanted here to cross-reference the examples. Dr. Bowser's presentation yesterday on the psychological effects of slavery, these points were also raised, and we need to face them head on in the context of this handbook and in the context of youth outreach. Redefinition of education is really where we're ending up. That This process is about redefining and eliminating divisive thinking in the context of education. And we understood that there was a productive, positive way to leave an educational legacy in respect of the slavery past. We also engaged with the question of the black complicity with slavery. How do we deal with this question? We're looking at slavery before slavery, in a sense, slavery before Africa. And this has to be acknowledged for truth and reconciliation across continents. There was consensus that we needed to capitalize on the UN diaspora heritage initiatives, such as the International Decade for People of African Descent, the UN General History of Africa project. Both of these offer us opportunities, and there are others, offer us opportunities to present a holistic, integrated initiative. And for example, there's an international network of site managers, and there's a need to make it more active. These allow us to address multi-layered narratives of slavery, blending stories of how slavery impacts us today. There's a global curatorial project which was also mentioned, started by Professor Bogues and others at Brown University. This is a Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, if my memory serves me here, through which meetings have been held in spaces such as South Africa, conference in Senegal planned for next year. We ought to be very much engaging with these initiatives and making them work for us. How do we create an ongoing, the final question, how do we create an ongoing and meaningful network between historic sites and other stakeholders? The question of indigenous knowledge systems came up, that we needed to have the link into the network of people working in this vein and thinking in terms of the distinction that is about the human versus any other kind of ethnic divisive representation, that this was a way to remove the basis for prejudice while acknowledging all generations. Online distribution for maximum audience reach. We needed to absolutely, and I know the handbook is going to be online, but we needed to link into various networks to be able to maximize that, and in particular within networks that are accessed by and used by youth. The issue of migration, now a political nightmare with antecedents in the problematic history of slavery. We needed to face this question head on, questions of displacement and exploitation that continue to plague us today and that need to be included in the way forward where new pedagogies around slavery are concerned. Finally, the consensus that truth is conditional, truth is relative, no longer even a moral issue, but that in the process of understanding all the perspectives and historical data, we want to engage multiple voices and to be inclusive. So you see, colleagues, I could have stayed at my seat. Many of these points were raised before. Thank you.
Sonjas, I think is a good report, like the one the Bill made, and I don't know how you could make all this discussion only in 2 hours. So it's very, very impressive. And now I would like to call the French-speaking group. Je voudrais inviter le groupe francophone de venir présenter. Voilà, c'est Stéphanie. Merci Stéphanie.
Alors j'ai le plaisir de vous parler en français. I'm pleased to speak in French today.
So, I am pleased to
Alors c'était un group francophone,
It was a French-speaking
mais
group.
nous étions constitués.
That-
Vous avez les écouteurs? Vous avez la traduction?
No,
Okay,
no.
so I'm going to speak in English. Okay.
Alright,
So
okay.
let's
So,
try a
bien.
direct translation.
On va
So
essayer
it
la
was a
traduction directe.
francophone
Donc,
group.
C'était un groupe
But we
francophone.
try to talk about a different situation concerning Europe, Africa, and the Americas and Caribbean. So I'm not going to answer to the three questions, but give you the different part of our reflection concerning the three questions. The first thing is that we noticed that we need to have a ethical project based on the fact that it is necessary to say and to stress that slavery was a crime against humanity, and because it is a crime against humanity, it concerns the whole humanity, and not only the communities, and not only the descendants, but the whole humanity. And as a crime against humanity, it was not only the Atlantic part of slavery, but also the Indian and the Arabic part of the slavery that is concerned backed by this dimension of crime against humanity. We noticed also as a principle that we have to get a common language and change some words and some verbs that we used. For example, we cannot speak anymore about slaves, but we have to speak about enslaved people, and so on. We think that we have to specify the goals and the objectives of the different sites, museum and memorial. Are they dedicated to conservation protection, or are they also dedicated to social transformation, cultural, political, and philosophical transformation and consciousness? We talked about the fact that there is a memory duty, devoir de mémoire, memory duty, that's it, devoir de mémoire, memory duty, but also a right to history, This means that it is important to work on the recognition of the fact, the events, and what happens in all the processes that occurred during the slavery period. And we have also to stress the fact that the silence and the denial procedure have limited the possibility of recognition of the importance of this crime, and have also discredited the memory request. And as another principle is to respect the dignity of the victims and to conciliate the exhibition of the slavery strategy, but also the dehumanization processes and the agentivity of the enslaved people altogether. Is it clear? Is my English correct? Yeah? Okay. I am making this is a translation in progress. The second point is what methodologies can be used for that. The first one is to have a scientific perspective and a pluridisciplinary scientific perspective. For example, including archaeology, history, based on the archives, human science, and oral history. The second thing is to constitute scientific committee, including the scientific experts, but also what we call the profane experts. Comment tu traduis ça? Les experts profanes? This is to say, including the memorial actors, the local associations, and the public spheres also into the scientific committees, and what we call les passeurs de mémoire, les détenteurs de l'histoire orale. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Okay. There is also the necessity to show the material patrimony, but also the immaterial patrimony and the oral history and memory. and the necessity to think as the sites are conceived, to think about the skill of evaluation on a qualitative and quantitative level in order to evaluate the exhibition, the programmation, but also the satisfaction of the visitors and public users. Then we think that it is necessary to address some recommendation to the politics and public policies in order to be sure that the history of slavery is and stay a universal and shared history. For this, it is necessary to promote the diffusion of this history with pedagogic means adapted to different public. It is also necessary to prevent the banalization and folklorization of the slavery. Then to pay attention to the effect, to the consequences of a global tourism, a memory tourism about slavery, and the consequences on the choice made in these sites, and the consequences on the banalization of slavery. And this is not my last point, oh my God. And to pay attention also to the partnership and to the constraint and the risk that can be included in such partnership when the financial partnership imposes some control of what can be showed in those sites. And then eventually, concerning the networks, they should be based on a global inventory of the sites. They can be made through internet platform, including the possibility to share experiences for the curators, for example. The networks can also be based on the labelization of the site, for example, use the UNESCO label Route de l'Esclave or so on. And then maybe to promote some national committees for the history and memory of slavery. And I think that has a conclusion. I have forgot what my colleague wanted to say. Nelly, what is the conclusion? I can't hear you. Please. So to promote publication dedicated to different publics, that's it? Okay, thank you.
Very much, Stephanie. Your English is better than mine, you know.
And so much better than my French if I'd had to do that. So we have two other groups still to hear from, those that were in Hotel A and B. So perhaps let's start with Hotel A. Is that Ana Lucia? Yes?
Hi, everyone. Just a second, because I need to look at my computer to have this done. Then our group had about 16 people. Most of our curators are people associated with different sites here in the United States, representing slavery then. Sites and museums, no big institutions except for Monticello. And regarding question 1, because the questions had a very target goal, that is the elaboration of a handbook on approaches in interpreting and representing slavery and abolition in museums and sites. Then regarding that, what principles we should follow? The first element that came, that was discussed was the issue of respect. really have to take into consideration the different audiences that are visiting our sites. Also the fact that these are people with different backgrounds who are not necessarily familiar with the topics that we are looking at. That is the issue of slavery. And respect then is important, is a crucial element. The second element that perhaps is as much important is speaking the truth, all dimensions of the truth. And this is, of course, we have always that idea that there are several truths, but at the same time, we should be looking at the scholarly research that has been done and to be able to engage and interpret that. One element that came into the discussion was the idea of get rid of the benevolent view of the master-slave relations, and also the necessity of talking about freedom and economic structures that feeded slavery. Another element that came as number 3 is sensitivity. We are asking who are these people who are coming to visit our sites, and we should give them a sense about the populations that were enslaved, a sense of dignity and humanity. And spirituality is one of these elements that should be perhaps emphasized. Emphasize, for example, what did allow the ancestors to move from one dimension to another, and the fact that they had to deal with a big level of spirituality to be able to cope with the tragedy that they came through. It was also emphasized the importance of listening our audience. We discussed the fact that many of the docents in the sites that have, or the places where we have volunteers or guides, that they are trained to work with a script. But depending on who are the visitors and what the context is hard to deal with this script, in terms of time especially. And you needed to find ways to listen to the audience. We are going to come back on this topic again. Then dialogue is important, is another element. Then create spaces to talk with visitors. For example, through different kinds of activities that go beyond the visit of the sites and the museums. For example, we mentioned lunchtime meetings. Also use arts to create forms of expression to express healing and so on. Then the idea of engaging people, empathy is a word that came several times. And also the element of engaging with African cultures. Engage with change, to bring to the sites that you are looking at, even those that are based in the Americas, but bringing this African dimension to the sites. And of course, if you are dealing here with sites that are in Africa, the dimension you have to study, to examine how you are going to put this in a handbook. But it was also emphasized the need of creating spaces for reflection, spaces to decompress. And it was mentioned the example of the National Museum of African American History and Culture here in Washington, D.C., where, of course, is the iconic example, because it's a big museum that has a lot of has a lot of means. But the idea of creating spaces to allow people to decompress, to think about the experience they got during the visit. And of course, that this space can be a tree, can be a stone, can be a shrine, can be a big memorial, as it's the case of the museum, but that we need time also to process the visit to these sites that are related to trauma. And one element that was much emphasized from my colleague from the group of the descendants from Georgetown, that the need of shift the dialogue about slavery to a dialogue that emphasizes strength, fortitude, and the resilience of the enslaved and free Africans in the Americas who endured slavery. Then to emphasize that these visits, these sites, is not about your guilt, it's not about your shame, but about those who survived slavery. And at the same time, then, to celebrate what enslaved Africans endured, what they lived, the experiences they lived. And another element that was much emphasized, which is problematic in a number of sites, especially here in the United States, but we're always thinking about other sites as well. Tell the truth to all different groups, women, whites, African Americans, peoples of African descent, young, elder, independently of their racial background, especially in sites where we have segregated tours. We emphasize the fact that depending on the site, if the group of visitors is white, there is one story that is being told, and if it happens that the group is black, then there is another story that is being told. And we need to tell the same story to everybody. Everybody should be able to take the story that is being told. Another element that was emphasized that is perhaps an element that is totally absent from many of the sites that we visit, not only in the United States, but also, of course, in the Caribbean, Latin America, Europe, and West Central Africa and West Africa, which is the sexual violence, this dimension that was essential for slavery to exist, and an essential dimension of the Atlantic slave trade, and that is usually evacuated from the narratives that we see in the sites. And at the same time, that is part of this discussion as well, that there is a need to engage with the history of slavery in the various parts of the tours. For example, we visit a mansion, and we don't talk about slavery inside the mansion of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, for example. But we talk about slavery when you go to visit the cabins. You want to talk about slavery, go take the slavery tour. The slavery tour usually is one time a day, sometimes once a week, sometimes the day that you go to that plantation. Depending on the day, on the time of the year, you are not going to get the slavery part. And everybody who goes to these plantations, to these sites, everybody, independently on the day, the time of the year, they should leave these sites with a clear history about slavery in the sites, because these sites, they only existed because slavery and enslaved people created the sites. And I think that this is the crucial element that we should bring here when we elaborate this guide. Finally, how do we identify best practices in interpreting and representing slavery and abolition from different regions of the world? Then there is a series of elements, of course, based on what we already mentioned. But we talked about immersive experiences. For example, the element of empathy, the fact of engaging with the public that is visiting is important. Perhaps to feel that the visitors, they feel the experience. They have at least some kind of contact with the experience that enslaved people, they lived. And to emphasize then, and to have a very open mind to sources that tell the story. And then to do this work of looking for the existing sources. And I'm talking here, of course, about primary sources, documents, and also about secondary sources that are the works that scholars, historians, and sometimes community historians, they did. And to leave sometimes, to abandon sometimes the traditional approach, depending on the site that you are looking at. Another element that is important here in terms of best practices is that each of these sites, these museums, see itself as part of a global system. Then Monticello is not disconnected from then Elbina Castle, from Valongo Wharf in Rio de Janeiro. Then all this is part of the same system. At the same time, we had the importance of staff. And of course, that is much easier to talk about this here in the United States than perhaps to talk about this in Cape Verde or in Recife or perhaps in Angola. But providing training then and providing the diversity training in the case of places where the majority of the population is white is an element that is very important. Incorporating also the lives of the enslaved in the exhibitions, and I think that here we didn't give examples, but in terms of best practice, of course, I think that the lives are being included in Montpelier, are being included in the museum that we are going to visit in Washington on Thursday, are being included in Monticello. Then this is an element that these narratives, these texts, these markers, insights should incorporate the lives of the enslaved. And we also emphasize the fact that the sites should and the museums should identify goals that they want visitors to achieve when they leave. There is something they need to learn from that visit that we should identify a number of these elements that should be achieved at the end. And one element that was much emphasized is community engagement. And I think that here, of course, we have a number of examples where the community was really engaged in the different initiatives. And finally, to answer the third question, that how do we create ongoing and meaningful network between historic sites and other stakeholders, then it's again elements that were already mentioned, the issue of perhaps creating websites, creating meetings like this one. And I think that the other one that we had here at UVA in October was another example of how we can create these connections between the work of scholars and the work of all of you who are on a daily basis in these different sites. Of course, facing the real problems, because us who are studying the history and the documents, or those of us who are studying memory, we are at one level, but most of you are dealing with the daily problems on how to create these exhibitions, how to deal with visitors, and so on. And I think that we should improve these dialogues, and I hope that this handbook will help us to continue doing that. Thank you.
And last, but not least, the Hotel B Group, Elizabeth Chu.
Hello. I will try to be brief, as much of what we discussed has already been mentioned. We were a small group of 7 people, and we were all museum and historic site practitioners. So I will just run down our list of principles, many of which have already been mentioned. So principles to be followed for approaches in interpreting and representing slavery and abolition. Emphasizing the humanity and the agency of the enslaved, engagement with descendant communities of both the enslaved and enslavers, having a way to help both visitors and staff process the emotions that the visit might, or the work might engender of trauma, shame, guilt. Not to shy away from discussion of violence, of rape, of the breaking up of families. For white practitioners in particular, to realize that this is our obligation, that we're not doing anyone a favor. That we acknowledge that we can't change the past, but we can change the future. Tell the truth based on documentation, and make that process transparent by providing access somehow to primary source documentation, to represent multiple perspective, to use the names of the enslaved where possible, and to, as others have said, to provide space for reflection on the visit. I'm really going to sort of put together the second and third questions because we sort of discussed them as one, but we emphasized the real need for us, for I think Americans in particular, to know more about international practice. I know that I, for one, am quite ignorant of it. So opportunities to visit other museums internationally, to network both formally and informally. So having this kind of conference is amazing, but to keep the networking going with, the handbook and sharing things on the web and having webinars, conference calls, any sort of ways to keep in contact and to keep the conversations going. We talked about, in terms of best practices, the real need for outcome measures so that we know how visitors are responding and what they're getting from what we're doing, and to take that into consideration as we sort of move forward. We talked about the importance of engaging young people even at the sort of middle school level, to understand that there are professional jobs in our world that are young, and particularly for young people of color, to understand that they can become archaeologists, museum curators, and that we can do this in our local communities as museum practitioners. And then that, and this is a big discussion in the American Alliance of Museums and other organizations, but that there seems to be this consensus of museums as spaces of activism and change, and that we are certainly, on the vanguard of that, and we just need to keep on keeping on. So, thanks.
Thank you. Really, I would like to thank all the groups for this incredible work that has been done. And I am really impressed by the amount of principle, methodology, approaches that you have here presented. And I think we have largely enough to now work on that. But thank you very much for having tried to respond to the 3 questions that we have asked in a very, very, in this way. Really, thank you very much. So I think now we have a lot of work on the way for us. So what would be the step forward from this meeting? I think first of all, I would like to, after having discussed with Gary, we will put all this, of course, your presentations, the reports of the groups will be put on website, on our website, on the website of the partners, and of course, also, if you wish, you can put it also on your own website. So that's the first thing we have to do to continue to inform also for the outreach. We would like also, I think all this discussion was live streamed, but we would like also then to make people accessible the link so that they can also look into that, and we will put it at least at UNESCO website. Now, all the group have mentioned the necessity of creating a network to continue the debate, the discussion, the conversation. And I just want to recall that we have created an international network for manager of site of memory a few years ago in Brazil. But at that time, we had in mind only a kind of outdoor open-air sites, but not museum was not really in our mind. But I think this network, which has the merit to exist, even if the network has not been that effective, and I think it will be a good opportunity to revitalize that network and to broaden it to include museum. That is a suggestion. I think with ICOMOS and all the partners, if we can work to see how we can really reinforce this network which is already existing and to broaden it. That is perhaps maybe a response to some of the requests, suggestions that have been made by the different reports. Perhaps Gary, for the step forward, was there other idea that you? you have
Well,
in mind?
No, I do think one of the things that we want to explore with you is, as Ali mentioned, we'll make the materials available online. We may also send out, I'm a big believer, you know, people have said things about survey and evaluation. I'm sort of a data geek. I'm kind of known for that. So certainly we'll also send out perhaps to all of you a really simple, short, brief survey to get from you some feedback, more detailed what would be a good way to stay in touch. Would you like to have, you know, we've heard several different ideas about ways to stay connected. So we may learn from you a little bit about ways that we don't want to assume that there's one particular way everyone, there never is, as you know, one particular way that works for everyone. So we may look for some ways to do that so we can offer a variety of avenues of communication. And then, you know, really look at these partnerships, because there are organizations that, you know, seek to facilitate knowledge exchange, that are looking at these topics. The university consortium studying slavery is a good model, just in some degrees for us. We can learn some lessons from that model. There's some partnerships there. So I think we've got, you know, this has given us, I think, a good inventory of ideas that we'll then come back to you with and broaden that network, you know, so that, and I like this, the very cross-disciplinary nature of it, right? We have people who work in the academy, we have people who are at historic sites, we have people who are activists, we have people working in communities, we have people who aren't historians, right, but in other ways are engaged in these questions. And I think that's what we're really seeking to do, is to find create a mechanism to have that kind of discussion. So I think there's really good opportunity in these ideas. So we'll look to try and refine that as part of our next step.
As far as the handbook is concerned, what we have in mind is to put together all your ideas and all the suggestions discussed here, and then to commission a group of consultants to help us work on that, improve it, and perhaps add it, and perhaps we would like you to have as a peer review and send it to you to when they prepare something, to send it back to you to see if for a peer review, and afterwards then perhaps to publish it. So we think this is a process that will take perhaps 1 year from now, and we hope that from now and 1 year we can have this resource book or handbook ready and put on, of course, on our respective websites for free access, and also publish some hard copies for those who are interested. So that is what we had in mind from now. And I don't know, I would like to give perhaps the floor to you if you have any other suggestion you want to add, any other comment or question.
Thank you. Just two very simple questions, which the second of which doesn't have to be responded to now, but well, one, I may have missed it, will a list of conference registrants be shared with everyone? That would be terrific toward keeping the network going.
Yes.
Good.
Yes,
That's great.
we have that. We have, in fact, we've cleaned it up, and we will be sending to all of you for whom we have contact. We have email contact information. We will send that list so that we'll share it with everyone.
Terrific. And then the second, you know, toward another host organization or consortia of organizations, perhaps wanting to pick up the baton, being inspired by what transpired here, could you share some details, either now or perhaps in the next communication, about what it actually took financially and organizationally to put this on? Really, because there may be someone out here who wants to do that.
We'll wait for the final bill, but yes. But yeah, no, I do seriously think that's a good, in other words, I think having the same kind of awareness and transparency of the resources involved, the people and the time and the financial resources. That's an excellent point, Bill. So sure, we will consider the best way to do that.
I'm not sure if this got mentioned in your in the description of what the handbook might be like, but I've been trained by lots of younger people to think in terms of video, audio, interactive pieces, so as wide-ranging a use of media as possible, and not the old-fashioned handbook I grew up with, which was mimeographed and coil spring bound.
Thank you very much. Yes, we will explore all the potentiality of the new technology that can help to be, yes.
Yeah, I'll point out it works for grown-ups. It works for every age too, right? I mean, part of our training material for our tour guide staff now, a lot of it is we have videos where we model the kinds of interpretive approaches and use of language, a lot of the issues we're talking about. We have a website we built in WordPress that's only available to them, that we do exactly that. So I think that's a very good point, Prinny, and that well noted.
Any other comment or? Okay. Okay.
Just the idea of figuring out how to get leadership at the highest levels invested in these programs and this work. So it came up in our group, the idea of boards of trustees, not just staff, because often it can be that rogue staff person who's trying to make something happen, and when they're gone, the program stops. So how to institutionalize in our missions at the highest levels a commitment to this.
I think any kind of guidance or best practices we have should include, the kind of patterns and practices for board training. Something that for the last couple of years we've done as well. Like we've done training for our board, and that has to be, tools to do that have to be part of it. I'm writing it down just now.
I would just like to emphasize the importance of living history theater from the oral history that we archive.
Duly noted. We'll make sure that there has to be an element of what the best practices and approaches are for that.
I will try to make just a remark about all the debates and the discussion we have during those 2 days. Maybe it is a French and Francophone question and perspective, but I was wondering how it can be considered that some of the slavery descendants are white, and some of the slave owners' descendants are black, and how this question is debated in different countries, and is it still possible to superpose the historic problems, the racial one, the ethnical one, and the political one? This is just a question. Yeah? The legal and the ethical one. Thank you.
Well, I think in the narrative that should be developed for the museum, I think this issue should be taken into account. Definitely, this is, I think, what the new way of telling and interpreting and representing this question of slavery should take into account what you said, Stephanie. So the good way, of course, it's important. I just want perhaps to, before giving the floor, I know that it was mentioned by the group too, to take into account the African history and the African context. Please, I just want to inform you that we have developed UNESCO, a whole collection of the general history of Africa. So you don't need to go to look for fact, event, or major and historical. It is already in a lot of things that you can take from that. collection, which is 8 volume of each volume has 1,000 pages. So this is also a resource that can help you. And we are developing the 3, updating the collection, and we are working on 3 new volumes. And Paul Lovejoy and others who are here are also contributing. So this is also something that could be that could serve as a source for you to talk about the pre-slavery period, what exists before the slavery. The idea is not to reduce the issue on the slavery, but to talk about what exists in Africa before. Yes, please.
Yes, I think it's important also that we don't leave our visitors, particularly our visitors of African descent, leave them feeling victimized. We need to empower them in some way by including their genealogy and the stories of success and accomplishments from the descendant community. And I think it's important to particularly leave children and young adults in knowing that the survival included people who made major accomplishments today in today's society.
Thank you for taking my question at this late hour. I just wanted to remember and bring to the table, because I'm so impressed with the level, the register of the conversation here, the universities that were represented and spoken of are, very prestigious institutions. And I teach at a school with maybe 1,500 undergraduates in Pepper Pike, Ohio. It's Ursuline College. And I'm thinking about the students, like how limited our resources there would be, but how much in need. I mean, I have students who come from Cleveland City schools, and they need this kind of education and this kind of support. And so do the kids at community colleges, and who don't have the same kinds of opportunities that they're going to get at Georgetown or at Columbia or at UVA. So I don't have a thought exactly about how I would approach this, but I would say don't forget that population as well, because partnering, reaching out to schools like mine and finding, ways of partnering with sort of smaller institutions or institutions that are, midway points, because that's going to be catering a lot to the population of students who have been historically underserved and underprivileged. So I just want to kind of bring that to the table as well. Thank you.
Prompted from Katrina's excellent point, maybe the handbook, in terms of guiding principles and other sections, could call out a case study, a successful instance of the principle at work in reality. And I'm thinking of Montpelier, for example, Courage. And if Montpelier, after they run their exhibit, which has just opened, if there's data to show that, in fact, visitation increased, or the range of visitors was broadened, this kind of data incorporated into the handbook could then be used to educate boards and potential donors.
Yes.
That this topic, if done courageously and creatively, doesn't scare people away. In fact, it does the opposite. And this is what the boards and those who are making decisions at institutions need to know and hear. Thank you.
That's an excellent suggestion. That's right. That's what often moves their decision making, is rooted in those kinds of, that, exactly right, showing them that kind of information. Any other final?
Thank you very much. It was an excellent conference. Loved the engagement and all of the various aspects that it brought to it. I would just say, please remember to make mention of all of those various ways that we are remembering, we are healing, we are restoring communities. Projects like the Port Marcus Project, the Slavery Shipwreck Projects that normally people would not know about, because I think once people leave these sites and these museums, they want something else beyond that. So we want to make sure that they know that there are lots of other activities around that they too can get involved in, because involvement means they're walking their way through that healing and that restoration. And certainly, please do not leave here and not come by our altar, a Darcy altar, and make sure that you pick up a stone so that you can remember those who perish and those who survive. But again, there's a lot more beyond the museums. Get into the communities. Please get into the communities and see what else is happening so that people can become engaged and feel productive as well beyond trying to understand. Thank you so much.
Well, that's well said, because obviously the work that's being done, the scholarship, the work that museums do, is not all the work that must be done. And it's a reminder that it's only the beginning. And it's in my notes to make sure that people take a stone, so I'm glad that you said so. And I think with that, I think we've at an excellent place to stop. And I thank all of you for your contributions, for your thoughtfulness, and for your concentration. I know we've kept the schedule very tight, so we appreciate that as well. So thank you. And I want to give you, actually, a nice round of applause for all your contributions. So I will conclude with a few notes just to help. Here's what's happening next, so we all know. So first, those of you, there are a handful of you I know who are members of the ISC, the International Scientific Committee. At the back desk, they have some instructions about transportation for your meeting site tomorrow, so where you will meet. And again, I'll remind everybody, if you're a panelist or moderator and have not already, also see the back